Welcome to The Exchange. I'm Dan Riley. The Exchange is a streaming internet talk show and podcast of interviews with noteworthy people about their lives, ideas, and current events.
This week I sit down with Russian opposition leader Ilya Ponomarev. During our conversation, Ilya talks about the rise of Vladimir Putin, the dissenting votes he cast as a member of the State Duma, his banishment from Russia, the recent assassination of anti-Putin activist Boris Nemtsov, and the future of his native country.
First of all, thank you so much for taking time and coming to this show, and welcome, and thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I'd love to start just by sort of asking you and learning a little bit about your personal biography and your personal background. If you could maybe talk about the last 10, 15, 20 years of your life, where you were educated, how you actually got into Russian politics, and then we can sort of take it from there.
Actually, as we're sitting here in San Francisco, many people say that I am their dream of a U.S. politician. Because I am originally an entrepreneur. I started working as a high-tech person, as a programmer when I was 14 and 16. When I was 16, I founded my first startup and had two startups, successfully exited them, and then joined a large corporation, which was Schlumberger, which was doing oilfield services. That's like the largest world oilfield services company, and then joined Yukos, where I got acquainted with Mikhail Khodorkovsky, one of famous Russian business people, and we made Yukos as the most successful Russian company, which sparkled a lot of jealousy and greed among some of our people in power, and Putin decided to grab the corporation for his cronies, and that's how I was pushed into politics. And so actually, it's already 12 years I'm in politics. I originally joined Communist Party of Russia because I always thought that the leftist ideas are those who are for direct democracy and self-governing of people, and that's what, to my mind, entrepreneurship is. And then we founded a new party, which was called A Just Russia, or Fair Russia can be translated differently, which is Social Democratic Party, the wide coalition of leftists. And on behalf of this party, in 2007, I got elected into parliament. So I already, 8 years, member of Russian parliament, representing Novosibirsk, which is the capital of Siberia, and also Russian version of Silicon Valley. That's the capital of Russian innovations.
Very good. I'd love to learn about sort of the first time that you met Vladimir Putin and what your impression of him was at that time. Do you remember the first time you interacted with him, and what was your general impression of him?
I met him numerous times, but not talked to him. Mm-hmm. At that time, I just was like looking at him. First time we talked, it was already when I was an MP, and we were discussing the state procurement system, and I was pitching him how we should reform the procurement system, and he surprisingly agreed. And as you understand, that's the source of all corruption in the state, through state procurements. And I was pretty happy that within 3-4 years after that, we actually managed to create a new law, which I co-authored and co-sponsored into in the parliament, and that really started some reforms in the country. But generally, my impression of him was it was very much as I expected. I expected that it would be a positive impression because that's his profession. He is trained to be liked. After 1-2 minutes of talk, you feel like that's your closest relative. That's the guy who understands you completely, that you want to confess with everything to him. That's the guy you love. And if you would not know who he is in fact, and you would not know his practice, and you would not know, what he is up to, then you can make very wrong conclusions. If you know, then, and he knows that you know, then you can start talking to him properly.
And before you met him, or when you met him initially, did you already have that fact in your head that the public presentation that you get from him when you have a conversation is actually different from who he really is and what he probably really wants out of you?
Oh, of course. I originally, when I joined politics, it was already in the opposition direction, because the thing that actually triggered my move from business side into political side was when Putin cracked down on NTV news station, the most professional and the most independent Russian news outlet. He squashed them because he wanted his control, and they didn't allow this control. They didn't allow censorship in their programs and their shows. So that was like the final push. And my most recent startup at that time, actually, because I was also running a venture fund for Yukos's shareholders, for Khodorkovsky and some of his partners, and we were investing in the project which was related to interactive TV. And our next round investors were supposed to be a group of people coordinated by Ted Turner of CNN. And when he saw what's happening with NTV, and that happened exactly when we were flying from Atlanta to Moscow, just signed term sheet with him, and then like the whole deal collapsed. And I at that time I decided, if politics is messing with your life, you start to mess with politics.
What year was that happened?
It was 2001. 2001, yeah.
And since that time, the perception, at least in the U.S., I think, of Vladimir Putin between now and then is that he may have been somewhat untrustworthy back then, but he's gotten progressively, seemingly more authoritarian. Is that your assessment of him as well? And if so, what exactly has changed in him from your perspective?
He was pretty much authoritarian from the day one. And there was never any illusion that he's like progressive, democratic, open-minded whatsoever. But in his early days, a lot of those who are right now protesting against him, they were saying, okay, so he's like mild version of Pinochet. He's like a person who wants to reform the economy, and he's doing all the right neoliberal type reforms. And he reformed tax code, he reformed labor code, he made a lot of other important changes. But to my mind, all those changes were on from the day one. At that time, we didn't need more privatization in our economy. We need to support more entrepreneurs. We need to demonopolize the economy. And he, vice versa, he actually encouraged those monopolies to grow. And he encouraged state to be more active player in the market. And to my mind, he was more capable than Yeltsin, and that was positive. But with all the negative signs, it was clear that all his charm would vanish pretty soon, and that's happened in 2003 when he sent my former boss Khodorkovsky to jail.
I know you have some family members that have a history of working in politics. Was it ever a goal of yours when you were growing up that you also would get involved in politics, or was it really, as you said, once the government was messing with your industry, you felt a responsibility to get involved?
I always had a passion for a change, and I always wanted to influence the society. But my parents, they were very much against politics. And when I was growing as a kid and when I was a young pioneer, I was literally running away from home to join like young pioneers ranks and to be active in the work of our organization, because they were saying like that's a dirty thing to do, and you shouldn't go there, and for God's sake never be a communist. And I had different opinion on that, but I decided that being an entrepreneur is the right way how I can influence and change the society. And only when it was repeatedly, my activities were repeatedly influenced by the actions of the state, and I saw how imperfect It wasn't, especially with this last push with NTV, which disrupted, terrific business that we were doing at the time. Then I said, no more. I have to be where I can be more efficient.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned in 2003 or around that time that one of your friends or one of your coworkers was arrested. Can you explain exactly what happened?
It's just that Putin was thinking he was pretty much like common, very much mediocrity former KGB colonel who was coming to power. Before that he was vice mayor of St. Petersburg in the most difficult days where you cannot make real money there, right. And he always dreamt of being rich and wealthy and prosperous and reputable in this sense. And he always believed in meritocracy. How much you have, that's how much you're worth in the society. So that was the reason why he decided that he needed to grab some large pieces of property, and they were all privatized among Russian oligarchs, tycoons, and he decided to go and chase the most successful one because he was also the most transparent and the most Western-minded, and it was the easiest target. And
also the wealthiest, if I remember correctly.
It was also the wealthiest, but the issue was that the assets were transparent because it was publicly traded company. It was a significant push to make it all clear, understandable, transparent for the shareholders, and that's why it was extremely easy to grab it.
Right. And he, and on a separate side note, he went on a hunger strike, right? I mean, he went to Siberia and was imprisoned for something like 10 years and almost went through with a hunger strike while he was in prison. Yeah,
he was in prison exactly for 10 years. He faced 2 trials. Both are totally ridiculous. I was testifying on one of those trials in his favor, but nothing worked because it was not a real trial. It just was execution, of what Putin has ordered. Yes, and he went through hunger strikes when he was trying to make conditions for some of his partners who were also sent to prison better. Khodorkovsky is a very decent person, and he said that he's a captain of that ship. He was asked many times so that we can liberate you and if you leave the country, and he said that he would be the last of his company to leave, and as soon as a single person is still in jail of his friends, he would be staying as well.
So you enter politics and you're aware of the dynamic of how Vladimir Putin sometimes reacts to opposition. Did that deter you in any way? I mean, it must have been at least somewhat intimidating to go against a force like that. What was your thinking when or a philosophy that you had about how you wanted to try to govern as a politician?
To go against, that's what my constituency trusted me to do. So, I would not run for the parliament if I would not make such promise for people. And, being in the opposition in Russia, you cannot promise much. Here in US, Democrats, Republicans, once in a while one is in the opposition, another time another is in the opposition. But anyway, even when you are in the opposition, you can, as a congressperson, help your constituency to get some appropriations, to get some projects, to lobby the interest of your people. In Russia, when you are in the opposition, you cannot do much because that's like a state monopoly. Only United Russia, only the ruling party can deliver something good for people. So my promise that I made to people who voted for me was extremely simple. If you vote for me, it will be one badass less in the government, in the parliament, and one normal guy, decent guy who do not lie to you would be one more. Mm-hmm. And that's the promise I had to carry.
And as you got in, I mean, what was your sort of track to becoming more of a vocal leader of the opposition movement? Was that something that happened right away, or did you sort of grow into that role the longer you were in the Duma?
I do not consider myself to be any kind of leader of the opposition. I'm one of most visible people because of my status and hopefully because of some ideas that I proclaim. I just think that my particular niche is in the reforms themselves and drafting those reforms. I combine experience of successful business activity, of successful government activity, because I also was managing some of the government projects, even being inside the opposition, like creation of network of high-tech parks in Russia, and I was one of founders of Skolkovo Foundation, which is like Russian high-tech development vehicle. We created a new university jointly between Russia and MIT. So we're doing things like that, and that's why I think that I can be active and successful in drafting new legislation, in drafting new constitution, in drafting the particular set of actions that are needed for my country to develop.
And did you see the longer that you were in the Duma that Putin was becoming more repressive? And if so, what were the 2 or 3 or 4 things that he did that really sort of shocked you or you viewed as being particularly harsh?
He never got tired in delivering something new for us. It was very much visible that he's getting worse and worse. Actually, probably, there were several really tragic events in Russia, because of course there was this blowing of apartment buildings in Moscow, where I think our security forces have actively participated.
Talk about that a little bit, because I think from Americans' perspective, learning about that is a bit like learning about it. It's viewed often as like the Russian 9/11.
Yes.
Well, remind the listeners exactly what happened when those apartments blew up, and where the blame was cast and what actually may have happened.
What brought Putin to power was the beginning of a second Chechen war, where Russia was victorious. And in the first Chechen war, Russia actually lost, mostly because soldiers have zero motivation to fight, because nobody considered that we should fight Chechnya. The society was very much against it. It was coming from the top. So it was needed to make something to make them motivated to fight and to claim the victory. And then the person who would be able to do so would inevitably become extremely important and popular inside the country. And to achieve this, a series of terrorist attacks in Russia, where they blew several of residential buildings, where
the government.
Nobody knows whom.
Okay.
Nobody knows whom. There were some scapegoats which were executed, in Chechnya,
right.
And nobody exactly knew, whether they were the people who were responsible.
And the scapegoats were the Chechens.
Yeah, they were Chechens. Yes. But it was pretty much obvious that who benefited was Putin and his team. They used these blowings, those terrorist attacks, as the justification to start the war, and Putin mobilized huge support behind him to become the president. I think it's very similar to what's just happened just recently with the assassination of one of very active members of the opposition, Boris Nemtsov, the former vice prime minister in Russia and Putin's competitor for the presidency in the year 2000. I think it's a very similar type provocation, which is targeted to unite people around Putin, so that he might get even more popular support.
And I want to get to him in just a minute, but before we do, the apartment buildings that were blown up in Moscow. Is that correct? It was
all across the country. There were 3 attacks in Moscow, and there were also attacks in Volgodonsk, next to Northern Caucasus, in Ryazan, and in some other places.
And in one of the apartment complexes, there was a bomb that diffused, that did not go off. And it had correct me if I'm wrong, but it had material in it that was from the Russian military.
Absolutely, not from military, but exactly from FSB, from the modern version of KGB. And then those folks from FSB said, we deliberately have done this because we wanted to test citizen readiness. It was a test. Because the evidence was so clear that it was implanted by FSB, so they said no, it's not like other bombs. This one, it was a test.
And this is a bomb that was in the basement or on the bottom floor of an apartment complex that was people were sleeping. I mean, there were
it was in Ryazan. Yes,
a resident. Okay.
Yeah. So it is if like you would catch someone in a skyscraper in the US. Putting the radio transmitter to be able to guide the airplane, and then he would say, yes, I caught red-handed, but it was just a test.
Right.
Would you believe in it? Of course not, and we don't believe in this either.
Does the Russian population believe that? Is that information well known? And if so, how does it influence their perception of Putin? Because one of the things that's so baffling, I think, to a lot of Westerners is that he seems to be so popular. The approval ratings we hear about is something like 80-85% approval ratings by the Russian population. How do you see that? And do people know about what may have gone on with the terrorist attacks?
Well, you see that the situation and these claims, they're so horrible. So to accept this information is extremely hard for an average person. And especially that you need to decide, if that's true, what would you do next? If that's true, you need to take a rifle and go and rebel against this government. You cannot tolerate it a single moment of your life any longer. And since people are not ready to rebel like that, in this situation I say, okay, maybe that's true, maybe that's not. Let's pretend it's not true because we are not ready. And it's like it's very similar to what was happening in Germany in 1933. When Hitler started assassinating Jews and sending them to concentration camps, and people just didn't believe it. Even here in the West, when there was such reports for President Roosevelt or to Prime Minister Churchill, they were saying, that cannot be true. It's like it's too horrible, and it's exactly like it's going with Putin. Western leaders, they say, it cannot be true. We're like living in the 21st century. It's just unimaginable.
Do you have any doubt that it's true?
Of course, I have doubts because I haven't seen it like in person. But the more time passes, the more I'm convinced that I'm not sure whether like Putin was personally giving orders for this, but that it was implemented through Russian security forces. I have now very little doubt.
I want to talk about some of your votes or some of your abstentions when you were actually in the Duma, one of which got a lot of press in the U.S., which was the act that no longer allowed Western countries, especially the United States, to adopt children from Russia. I think you abstained from that vote, and
No, I didn't abstain. At the beginning, I was the only one who voted against. Then this number grew to 8 people in the final reading. Yeah, of course, I was against, and I was one of the most vocal critic of that act.
Very good. And when you did that, was it well known that you would most likely make that vote? And if so, did any of Putin's people come to you and say, it's important that you vote with the majority, and if you don't, there might be consequences?
For that particular law, it was not yet the case. It was the first law when the presidential staff actually tried to consolidate all the political parties within State Duma so that it would be like unanimous support from all political parties. But at that time, they didn't try to work with individual deputies, like to make everyone, every single person vote for. Later they corrected that mistake, and for many laws after that, they have started working with everyone.
And one of, if not the most famous vote that you probably have ever cast was regarding the annexation of Crimea.
Yes.
What went through your reasoning as to why that was a bad idea? And talk about if there was any peer pressure from the rest of the country to vote in favor of it. Did that exist?
Of course, the majority of Russians think that it's fair that Crimea is Russian. And I want to confess, I also think that it is fair because of the history and the way it was turned to Ukraine also was not likely to be a constitutional at that time during the Soviet Union times. And of course, it was totally irrelevant when Soviet Union exists, whether it's formally Ukraine or Russia, you know, it really doesn't matter. Right. So it would be right if people, when the Soviet Union collapsed, would have been asked where do they want to go, whether they want to go to Ukraine or whether they want to go to Russia or whether they want to become independent, you know, it would be fair. But they were not asked. And moreover, Russia has signed an agreement with Ukraine. And it was a very conscious agreement that Ukraine is abandoning its nuclear weapons in return for us acknowledging their territorial integrity and that the Crimea is Ukrainian. And that was an agreement, and it was ratified, you know, it was approved, you know, and we are to fulfill it. We are to follow it, and we are to honor it. Additionally, the way how we have conducted this so-called referendum in Ukraine, it was obviously done under military pressure, and nobody would ever consider this to be a legitimate referendum, even if the majority of the population indeed wanted to go to Russia. And that's like a legal part of this thing. With this nuclear thing, it's a very bad precedent for countries like Iran or North Korea, because now it's like it's a living proof. It's an evidence that they should stick to the nuclear weapons. They should never abandon them, you know, because nobody would honor their territorial integrity otherwise. So it's dangerous for the whole of the global security system. But also there is very much emotional thing. At that time, it was perfectly clear for me that it meant war with Ukraine, and Ukraine was our closest ally, and there is not a single family in Russia who would not have any relative on the territory of Ukraine. So that means a tragedy for millions and millions of people. And unfortunately, I was right. After the annexation of Crimea, this war erupted, and already there are tens of thousands dead people in eastern Ukraine, and that's horrible.
Did you fear for your safety after you cast that vote?
You know, it was very much clear that I would be under big pressure, and being in the opposition especially last 3 years after Putin is back as a president, physical pressure was always the case. And I have several attacks on myself. You see, my nose is broken. It's because of some attack by skinheads on me several years ago. But of course, I would never think that they would dare start shooting at people.
As I understand it, right now you're not welcome in Russia. You were deported. You were kicked out of the country.
I was not deported. They just waited when I was on the business trip here, and then they closed the border for me.
So what's the story? So you were on a business trip, and then you tried to get back into Russia, and they wouldn't let you in, or what? How did you learn that you were no longer allowed in?
That was actually published in one of pro-Kremlin newspapers called Izvestia. Firstly, they spread some rumors that I was assassinated by Crimeans, that I was lynched and sank in the Crimean Strait, and that my car and my body was recovered in Crimean Strait, and it was reported by no other person but the Prime Minister of Crimea, Mr. Aksionov, who is a famous mobster, and actually that's why I think he was picked up by our Kremlin administration to run the Crimea, because they needed somebody loyal and very decisive. You know, it's like name Al Capone, the governor of California, just because, you know, they were afraid of California being split away from US, you know. That was clear sign, and then Izvestia published an article that federal bailiffs are using the civil case that Skolkovo Foundation opened against myself as the ground to close the border for me. There is such a preemptive measure which is usually been used to not to allow a person to go outside Russia, so that the debtors would not run away from their creditors. Right. In my case, it was used in the reverse direction.
So were you about to get on a plane to take you back to Russia, and they took you off the plane, or how exactly?
No, it was just published. It was confirmed. My office in Moscow contacted bailiffs, and they confirmed that yes, that's what they are doing. At the same time, they have seized all my assets there, so my credit card stopped working, and they reported that they are seizing my apartment and my car and everything. So if I would go there, most likely, they would not be able to prevent me from entering, because I still have parliamentary immunity from the criminal prosecution or detainment or things like that. So most likely I would be able to get in. But then, where should I live, and what should I eat, stuff like that.
Is there a time in the future in which they've informed you that you will be able to get back in, or not?
That order that is used as a ground is supposed to expire in May, because they are taking away my salary plus those assets, accounts whatsoever, and that is supposed to repay all the claims that Skolkovo is making against me. If they would not invent something new, then I hope that in June I will be able to go back, but we'll see.
You mentioned Boris and what just happened to Boris. I couldn't possibly do an interview with you right now without asking about what happened. And given your desire to go back, if that has given you second thoughts.
It is giving me second thoughts, but my decision is the same. What happened, I think, is a year ago when the whole thing with Ukrainian has started. It triggered the process of a major redistribution of power within the country. It firstly was focused more on economy and on business activities. And in recent months, it started getting more and more about political power and the security. And I think that who planned this murder are those who are very close to Putin and who are fighting for the influence. There are numerous historical precedents when it was very much clear when you create a crisis, and then those who are able to sort out this crisis would be the most influential and the most important. So I think that what is their plan is they would blame somebody like Khodorkovsky as the leader of the opposition, as the most prominent figure in the opposition, that he has planned this to compromise Putin in the eyes of international community. Or they could blame Ukrainian security forces, that it was them again to compromise Putin in the eyes of international community and force US to start delivering lethal weapons for them to protect Ukraine. So I think that this is one of two versions that would be on the display in the near future, and in both cases the security guys who would identify the scapegoats for it, they would benefit.
Right. Last question I want to ask you, from an international perspective, from the American perspective, from the international community perspective, what can we do in your judgment to try to improve the situation of what's going on in Russia and what's going on in the Ukraine?
I think that there is not much that can be done directly, inside Russia, in direct cooperation with Russia, whatever, because the level of mistrust right now is so high, and actually the quality of decisions that people in the US are undertaking is so low on the international arena that I highly doubt that there will be any positive things. But the Russian community here in the US is growing very rapidly because of Putin's actions. And those people are really angry, and they want to do something positive about their country. And if they would be supported and encouraged to not maybe to go back, they are not no revolutionaries, but to work closely with the opposition, to develop this vision of Russia after Putin, to draft this concept of changes. Like Ukrainian diaspora does fundraise for the social and political activities which Russians have never done before. Then we ourselves, we will do everything what is needed because we understand this.
Very good. Thank you so much for taking the time and coming on the show.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. If you're interested in learning more about The Exchange, want to listen to episodes online, or would like to reach out to the show, feel free to visit the show's website at theexchangeshow.com. One additional quick note. I'd like to thank the Commonwealth Club of California for hosting this interview.